Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis, LA and dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello, could I please speak with Bernie Krause?
This is him.
Hello, Bernie. I am so happy to be reaching you, and I'm so pleased that you're part of the Quarantine Tapes. I really wanted to capture your voice. And I am wondering, where do I find you at the present time?
Right now, I'm a couple of kilometers to the northeast of Sonoma, which is about, an hour's drive north of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. And we're here in my wife and I are here in a temporary home because a few years ago we got wiped out by the California fires in 2017. And so we're in a temporary place now until we move into our new dwelling, which should happen sometime in June.
What did you lose in that fire?
Paul, we lost everything. Everything that we had, we lost. We lost our cats. We lost our home. We lost all my journals, my archive, the original recordings in my natural sound archive. 50 years of slides and photographs. So everything really that we had, we lost. And we learned very quickly what it's like to live with not many things, which we still haven't replaced. And I don't think we're ever going to do that.
But you lost your archives, which is something that is irreplaceable. And what did those archives have that you no longer have, and what can you in a way reconstruct from memory?
Well, actually, Paul, the natural sound archive that I had was begun in 1968. So it was over 50 years old. And what I lost was all of the old analog recordings, because until the late 1980s, most of the recordings that we were doing were done in an analog format with audio tape, those old tape machines that you remember. So we certainly lost all of those, and I lost all of my wonderful collection of recorders and all the transitional gear from analog to digital. So I lost all of that stuff. But what I had done was in March of 2017, 6 months before the fires, I had been exchanging a correspondence with a lot of my colleagues at NASA and also at the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in the U.S. And because I had a lot of information and was doing a lot of work for the government related to climate change. And so they warned me that if I didn't make a backup of my work and get it offshore somewhere where it would be safe, that I ran the risk of having all of that material compromised by our current administration, which is notably anti-science. So I had a copy of that archive and got it offshore to a group that's really been sponsoring us for quite a while now, the Fondation Cartier in Paris. And they have two complete copies of my data, which is fabulous. So when the fire came, we were prepared for earthquake. We weren't prepared for a fire because California is known for its earthquakes. And so I lost 3 copies that I had, 3 backup copies that I had, but luckily one was in Paris and one was in a bank vault here in Sonoma, and I saved most of the material that I had recorded. So the recordings I still have.
How extraordinary! What a relief to hear this, because in getting to know your work, which is so interesting, what is at the core, it seems to me, is this whole notion of loss. In these 50 years of you recording the soundscape you've created, so much of what we heard once upon a time is no longer. And I'd love you to talk about the depletion of sound, in a sense, and the way in which perhaps one could say that we've become illiterate to sound.
Well, there are several issues there, of course. The first one about the loss of the natural soundscapes. Mostly they've just changed. They've become overwhelmed by human noise, and the all of the things attached to capitalism, because capitalism is very, very noisy. It requires a lot of energy, and as James Watt, who was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of the Interior for a while, once said, he said, "Noise is power, and the noisier we are as Americans, the more powerful we appear to other groups," which is which is an amazing statement. But it's true.
Wow.
The other thing,
wow.
Yeah, think about that.
Wow.
Isn't that fabulous? That's a really great statement.
Incredible. Anyway, let me not interrupt you. I just had to react.
Well, yeah, sure. There are a lot of reasons to react here. But the other thing is that over 50% in the time that I've been recording, over 50% of the recordings that I have in my archive can no longer be heard in their original form. They are from what I would call extinct habitats, or habitats that are so radically transformed by human endeavor that the sounds can no longer be heard in any of their original form. So it's unrecognizable. One of the neat things about this archive is that when I began recording it, I didn't record like most of the recording collections of the protocols of most of the recording collections that were made before then were made with single individual recordings of birds and insects and mammals and so on, and amphibians. And what these collections did was to take these things out of context. Well, the problem is you can't put them back into a context once they're taken out. So what they have these huge collections of individual sounds. They exist all over the world, and because we could do that, and part of the model was because we had the technology to be able to abstract all of these things and take them out of that important context, we lost something very important. It's a little like, I say in my TED Talk, it's a little like trying to understand the magnificence of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony by abstracting the sound of a single violin player out of the context of the orchestra and hearing just that one part. You lose everything.
Right.
And so I started in 1968 because my background was originally from music before I got into this.
And I'd love you to say something about what preceded this this interest and obsession of yours to capture sounds, how you started, because I must say that is fascinating.
I was just about to say that because I come from a background as a composer and a musician, recording studio musician, I always imagined sound in a context. Right. So when I first began to record these sounds, several things had happened to conspire at the same time. First of all, and most important, was the technology, the stereo technology was just becoming available to researchers to record in the field. So small portable recorders that were stereo were becoming available just in the late 60s when I began to do this, as well as microphone systems that you could use outside. And so when I went out for the first time, I went out with a system like this. And when I turned on the recorder and heard that sound, it changed my life. And I've been recording that way ever since. And I decided to do that really in contrast to the older models that have been around, since 1889, when the first natural sound recording was made by Ludwig Koch, a German recordist, 8 years old. His father had just given him a wax cylinder recorder, and he recorded a common shama in his backyard in Germany, and that was the first recording that was ever made of the natural world.
There's something nearly, how can I say it? Coming back to this idea of loss. There's something in the work you do which is a work of saving for posterity sounds that we no longer can hear. And I'm wondering, with this landscape going silent, what motivates you deeply to continue to struggle to save these sounds as they are waning?
Well, I've got a secret to reveal here, Paul.
Okay, and I love the notion of a secret to reveal. It always reminds me, I don't know if it's Thomas Jefferson or one of the presidents said that for two people to keep a secret, one has to be dead. But please go ahead.
Well, here's the secret for what it's worth. I have a terrible case of ADHD that I've had since I was a kid. This attention deficit disorder has been seminal to the ways in which I've been able to operate in this world. And the only thing that's made a difference to me is listening to natural sound. Drugs didn't do it, no medication, no therapy, nothing did it. The only thing that has mattered to me and helped mitigate that situation is natural soundscapes, listening to natural soundscapes. I don't know why they appear to be such a strong antidote for me, but that's the reason. That's the main reason that I do it. And then later on, as I began to work on my doctorate in the late 70s, when I was already 40 years old, when I began to work on my doctorate, I discovered that there were also more reasons to record than just my own selfish interest in it. That there was science involved here, that there was really a connection to the natural world that nobody had thought of before. To your earlier point, we're a visual culture.
Right.
And in science and literature, most of what we know about the world or have expressed about the world comes about from what we see. There's a large vocabulary in English and many other languages for what we see. There is not a large vocabulary to describe what we hear, except in music, perhaps. But that's very arcane and limited to musical composition. But other than that, there's no vocabulary to express what we hear. And I thought, geez, it was really important to think about ways that we could bring the whole population back into balance a little bit and balance out our senses and the power of our senses to include a little bit more of what we hear. And so that's also been another one of my goals, not only through my books, but also through my talks and sound work, the fine art work that I'm doing recently.
Strikes me as so important because what we hear is so deeply connected to how we listen. And listening is already, you know, as John Cage said, a form of composition. And it seems to me so important that we go back to that sense of hearing, which is one of our most important ways of actually learning. I myself, speaking to you now on the phone, I always have found the phone inebriating because one hears the grain of the voice. I've often said that I could never fall in love with someone whose voice I didn't love. Reminds me of a wonderful line of Isabel Allende, who said, the Chilean writer, who said that in Latin America, people make love through the ear. Through the ear is such an incredibly important organ, as it were, and you've devoted your life to that sense, to that organ. You once said, I think quoting Paul Shepard, the further we draw away from the natural world, the more pathological we become as a culture. I'd love you to unpack that a little bit, also bringing it in a way to our present moment and even to this tremendous and terrible pandemic.
Well, sure. You know, all of a sudden, with the world's population anxious and frightened and eager to return to a normal that never existed, we're faced with extraordinary contradictions. We look around us and the air is clean. From our temporary home, for instance, we're located on a hill in California wine country. We can see the buildings in downtown San Francisco 40 miles, 65 kilometers distant from here. And we're getting reports. Here's the other thing. We're getting reports of water so clear in the Venetian canals that old-timers who've never seen these things before can see fish for the first time. We're getting email from friends living in densely populated cities remarking that they can hear birds for the first time in spring. Their cities are so quiet. Like just a couple of days ago, I got this email from my editor in New York. I'm writing a new book right now, and he's been in lockdown in New York City, in Manhattan, for weeks. And he said in the morning he takes his coffee out on the one of the balconies of his fire escape outside his bedroom window, and he's heard birds for the first time in his life. He was raised in Manhattan, and for the first time in his life, he's hearing birds sing in spring. Can you imagine that? And yeah, he said the city is so amazingly quiet. And he said, and then I'm getting these notes from like marine biologist friends who are reporting that they're able to hear whale vocalizations from an estimated 100 kilometers away. That's 60 miles away. The oceans are now so quiet with shipping down to a fraction of what it was in early March. Now, what's remarkable about all these reports is that all we had to do was to stop everything, to alter our destructive progression of unending resource consumption on a very finite planet.
Paul Shepard had said that the further we draw away from the natural world, the more pathological we become as a culture.
Sure.
And I'm particularly interested in you in you're developing this perhaps also in the context of this pandemic.
Well, when I use that statement of Paul Shepard's, I usually say, if you don't believe that, just watch the news, and that's the key. We have to just watch the information that's coming to us through various media and groups that are what's called now influencers, to see how crazy we are, and we're totally nuts. We can't seem to get any sense of what it is to be alive, to be thriving, to be part of a living world, and we just don't get it, and I'm astonished at that. It's like Pico Iyer. You were interviewing Pico Iyer a while ago. He's a big hero of. And he says, it's not what we hear on the news. He said, because that's mostly noise, and he never watches more than 5 minutes of it in any given day.
Or less.
Yeah, he said, but it's what we do with that information that matters. In response, we need to ask ourselves a kind of internal dialogue to recalibrate. How are we acting with regard to the health of the planet, or our community, or our family, or our neighbors and loved ones? And these are the key issues that we need to pay some attention to.
One of the students you had in your early days who you admired so much was Frank Zappa. And I've always been taken by one comment of his where he says, a mind is like a parachute. It doesn't work if it is not open. And to my mind, that is really important in terms of our mind not only being open, but us also being open to the sounds of this world. And you were saying a little bit earlier that what this pandemic, not to say the silver lining of this pandemic, but this pandemic has shown us, perhaps, if we care to look and if we care to listen, that there is another way for us to live. There are other priorities we can have. And I'm wondering, if you were to believe that there is some hope, what would the hope look like after this pandemic is over, as it were?
Well, I'm hopeful that, in kind of a nebulous way, that we can begin to understand how important and how extraordinary the life of the natural world is, and how important it is for us to recognize that. So I'm hopeful about that. And when I get up in the morning, that's the thing that kind of powers my day. But then, I began to look at my archive. I began to take a look around and see the ways in which I'm writing and feeling right now, particularly with this pandemic. And I got to tell you, Paul, I'm not terribly optimistic. And yet, the other side of that is, and then I'm smacked in the face listening to Greta Thunberg and her enthusiasm and extraordinary, drive to make the case for our survival. And I think to myself, okay, but maybe I'm optimistic again. Maybe I can, reach deep down and get some more enthusiasm going here. And I keep changing all the time, but then that's that's the position where I'm at 81 years old. And let me tell you, when you reach a certain age or certain ages of your life, your perspective changes depending on how you feel and how you're seeing things and how you're comparing all the information that you have and all the life that's gone by with other times and other sensibilities, because our sensibilities change.
Our sensibilities change, and what is also interesting is, at this moment, as you said, we're beginning, your friend in New York, or you yourself in quite a few miles away from San Francisco. You can see San Francisco. You can see things that one couldn't see before this pandemic. So there is this recurring idea that perhaps we can be a little bit more mindful of not destroying this planet, and perhaps there is a way in which this is showing us a way of living that might be different. And there's this wonderful line in The Storyteller, an extraordinary essay by Walter Benjamin, where he says, it is possible to see a new beauty in what is vanishing. And in a way,
Yeah.
what is extraordinary in this moment is that what seemed to have vanished is reappearing, Bernie.
Yeah. Well, it's reappearing in one sense, Paul, but it's also calling to our attention at the same time. And these are things we have to look at and we have to pay some attention to. And it is that, since 1970, 3 billion birds in North America have disappeared. In terms of populations and migration and the rest of the important issues that are signals to us about what's happening in our environment. In Germany, 70% of the insects have gone. We're looking at honeybees in decline all over the place. These things we have to pay some attention to as well. Yes, what's happening now with this virus is people have had to slow down, and they don't have anything else to look at much except the outside world, because they're looking out their windows and they're opening up their windows and they're listening to the world in a way that they never did before. Viruses don't understand borders. Neither does climate. And every action we take, every decision we make is a piece of fabric that links to all other parts of a larger system. And if it's not too late, when and if we learn to thrive together as part of that living, breathing, life-affirming organism, as part of it, perhaps there's going to be reason for hope. And I live for that. I'm fueled by that every day.
I heard with what great care you expressed this, that using the word perhaps, and there's a statement of yours in closing that I'd like you to comment on. It haunts me. You said, no matter how one tries to twist the meaning conveyed through natural soundscapes, and in particular the biophonies, they will nearly always express answers that approach a level of Socratic truths, whether we want to hear it or not. What are those truths?
Yeah, well, what I'm concerned about when I was talking about, I was actually comparing with a colleague some notes, and my colleague was saying, I'm very Platonic about this, and I believe in truths and solid truths, and I said, well, I think I'm more Socratic, because for me it's always important to ask the question why, and to keep the dialogue going, because we never really come up with answers that even in much of science is an ongoing mutable thing. And I think that from my experience, the living world, is expressed in more Socratic terms than it is in Platonic terms, in that sense. I can't recall exactly the moment that we had that discussion or that caused me to write that, but that's really kind of the sensibility that I was thinking about at that particular moment.
And we better ask those questions now. As you said, we need to be mindful. To come back to the Zappa line, we need to be that parachute.
The other thing is that the world that we've created is a world designed to accept only answers to questions that we raise. And we turn to religion because religion has answers. We turn to any kind of conspiracy theory because a conspiracy theory has an answer. So these are Platonic ways of looking at the world. I don't see the world that way. I see the world as changing all the time and full of surprises. It challenges us because our human mind, on the one hand, wants those answers and wants to know the truths of the universe, but we're not going to ever get those. One of the other things that Paul Shepard said was that we'll never understand the natural world as it is because we're not meant to do that.
Right. And to remain and to live the questions rather than seek the definite answers.
Yeah, and it's much more important, and you can feel much more comfortable with that if you finally accept that that's the way we have to live.
Well, Bernie, it's been such a pleasure to speak with you. I can't wait to that moment when we meet. I'd love to go in the fields with you and hear things that maybe my auditory illiteracy has kept me from hearing. I would so much relish a moment with you in nature. And for the moment, I send you but a virtual hug, but hope that someday our paths really do cross in person. I want to thank you for taking this time, and I really hope that you stay well and safe, and that our paths cross before long.
You too, Paul, and it's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Real great pleasure. Bye-bye, Bernie.
Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.